engaged with our question and answers portion. We promise we won't call you out or anything. Let's see here. All right. Well, welcome. I'm going to keep letting folks in as they join, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm David Eady, the Director of Industry Engagement with the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business. I think everyone in the meeting knows me, has met me, and has been engaged in previous conversations we've been having with the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact. We have a working group specifically looking at opportunities to decarbonize our electric grid, and this is a continuation of those conversations. We've had a great meeting with the utilities back in the summer in August. I'm talking with Georgia Power, MEAG, Power, actually Electric Cities of Georgia, representing MEAG, and the Georgia EMC folks. And we've had some follow-on presentations and discussion around virtual power purchase agreements. And our last meeting was trying to dive into what are some of the options for moving forward. And we are thrilled to have with us Reid Spolek, who's the Global Clean Energy Procurement Lead at Google. And he's based out in Portland, Oregon, but he's going to talk with us about Google's journey to explore 24/7 carbon-free energy by 2030. Good, nice, ambitious goal or target to be aiming for. So with that, I'm really going to just go ahead and pass it over to Reid. Actually, one other thing, if you all would go into the chat and just put in your name and company or organization name, just so we make sure, because some folks don't show up as with their name on that. So if you could go into the chat and just let us know you're here and who you are. And with that, I'll pass it over to Reid.
Excellent. Thank you, David, and thank you to everyone for joining today. As David mentioned, I'm Reid Spolek. I look after our clean energy procurement program here at Google. And today we just wanted to talk a little bit about our clean energy journey. I have a few slides that I was going to walk through just to help facilitate the conversation, and then open it up for broader questions as we go. As I'm talking, though, definitely don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask questions, although I'm going to have the slides up on my laptop, so I won't be able to see your hand. So just speak up and voice over any questions you have, and hopefully I'll be able to address those. So I'm going to go into screen sharing mode here, and so bear with me.
So we're seeing your screen already. If you just want to put it in a presentation mode. Yeah,
great.
There we go.
Is this like a presentation mode?
Yep, good to go.
Okay, excellent, perfect, great. Well, thanks everyone for the time today. So I'm here to talk about our kind of carbon-free energy journey, and there's kind of a few aspects of that. First, I want to talk a little bit about sort of our data centers, and what is all this energy going towards that we have this 24/7 carbon-free energy journey. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual journey itself. What goes when we say 24/7 carbon-free energy by 2030? What exactly that means, and why we care about that, and how we go about doing it. And then I'm going to talk about some of the at least I think cooler innovations that Google has going on towards that end. So like I said, please feel free to stop somewhere along the way, and I'll hopefully answer any questions you may have.
So yeah, if you want to also put questions in the chat in real time, we can also try to monitor that. Or if you want to hit the raise your hand button at some point, I'll call attention to you as well.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. So first, I guess the fundamental question is, well, what is all this energy that gets used? And so when you think about Google, I'm sure you think about, Google.com, Gmail, YouTube, maybe our Google Cloud services, all of these different services. And those are all obviously internet services, but they're hosted on our physical network of data centers. And we have a network of 24 of these massive data center campuses that are distributed all over the globe. And each of these data center campuses uses, hundreds of megawatts each, which, as many people on this call know, is the equivalent of, a small town's worth of energy usage. So when you add that up, that's a very large amount of electricity that we're using on an hourly basis. And we do everything we can to take accountability and do what we can from that environmental footprint standpoint. So first and foremost, we fully stand by the age-old adage that the cleanest megawatt hour that there is the one that you don't use. And so there's a huge amount of work that has gone into the engineering behind our data centers to keep them energy efficient wherever possible. If you think about your own laptop and you think about, sometimes the fan is running, sometimes it gets too hot, sometimes it malfunctions based on getting overloaded. That applies to all of our servers all over the world as well. So we have these massive cooling networks that we build out, and with all sorts of fairly complicated engineering feats in order to keep that cooling engineering usage, or the engineering to keep cooling resources down. And that's energy, that's water, that's materials. There's a whole amount that goes into that. I'm not the engineer, so I can't speak to the specifics of those engineering feats, but I always try to start by talking about the highlight of engineering being a big part of keeping our data center energy usage down. And one way of looking at that one metric is what we call PUE, or power usage effectiveness. And that's really just the ratio of the overall energy that the data center is using, and the denominator of that ratio is just the computing use that is used to power things like YouTube and Google Cloud and other services like that. A typical data center, more off-the-shelf data center, that's more of a 1-to-1 ratio, and the goal is to get that PUE down as low as possible. And so we say based on the average data center, we're about 1.5 times more efficient than the typical data center, which is just a big home run off the bat from a clean energy standpoint, because that's clean energy we don't need to go buy to offset that of a typical data center. So about our renewable energy procurement in general. So we started building these data centers all over the world. Back in 2012, we said, hey, we want to go out and buy renewable energy to offset this energy that we're using in all those data centers all over the world. And for us, we call this very specifically our 100% renewable energy matching goal. And the idea there is that on a global basis and on an annual average, we use and buy as much renewable energy as we use at our data centers on a global average basis. This is kind of the hallmark of corporate energy purchasing. So we first set this goal in 2012, and you can see in 2012, 2013, 2014, we started marginally making a dent in that as we started signing more and more power purchase agreements. And I'll talk a little bit about power purchase agreements here in a second. But we bought more and more renewable energy, and eventually got to the point where in 2017, for the first time, we bought as much renewable energy as we used. We were the first major company to achieve this feat. If you look at many other data center companies, they're still working towards this feat. It is a relatively profound feat that we're quite proud of here at Google. And we first met that in 2017, and we've kept it up as our data center usage has grown between 2017 and 2020. Call it a 20% year-over-year increase. We have increased our renewable energy purchasing to make sure we're staying on track and keeping up with our data center energy usage. Most recently, we used about 22 terawatt hours in 2022. To put that in perspective, A city like San Francisco uses about 10 terawatt hours in a calendar year. So, the way I like to think about it is we use about 2 San Francisco's worth of energy on a global basis. And that means we're also going out and buying renewable energy to offset that at an equivalent amount. So that, well, I'll get into some numbers later on, but it equates to a huge amount of renewable energy. And when we're going out and buying renewable energy, we almost always do that through power purchase agreements. And I know many people on this phone call are familiar with that. But for us, what that means is we go and sign a long-term energy offtake contract for a new potential wind or solar farm that would get built. And then by doing that, we provide the guaranteed revenue offtake that they need to go get the financing to build the project, because they have a guaranteed revenue stream. And that's what we call additionality, where if not for our guaranteed revenue offtake, this wind or solar project would not have get built. Therefore, our participation makes it new to the world. So therefore, all of these projects are new to get built because of Google's participation. And that has led to this we've signed a number of these over the years that have added up to these blue bars that you see here. So that's how we've contributed to our 100% renewable energy matching goal, first achieved in 2017, and we've kept it up every year since then. More recently, in 2020, we announced our more ambitious goal, and that's our 24/7 carbon-free energy goal. And this is a little different definitionally, so I'll try to explain kind of what we mean by that. And so 24/7 means in every hour of every year, we're matching the same amount of renewable energy we're using in the same grid, of energy we're using in the same grid of a data center with the equivalent amount of carbon-free energy. Now, this really moves the goalpost in terms of difficulty, because not only do you take it from an annual average down to an hourly average, but you also take it from a global average down to a grid level average. And as those of you know, each grid has its own idiosyncrasies and nuances that make it often very difficult to procure renewable energy. But that is the level of the bar that we've set for ourselves, is to really do it within those same grids. And the reason we're doing that is we think that it is the right thing to do to take accountability for the true impact on the grid that our data centers impose based on using all of this energy. And it's an around-the-clock energy profile, but it needs to be addressed. There are certain hours during the day when the wind isn't shining, or the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, and there's still non-carbon-free or carbon-intensive energy sources that are powering our data centers. And so we want to be accountable for that. And we also want to just set a precedent for other large users. I think it's important for others over time to also kind of take accountability for their true environmental impact, and from a sustainability and just sort of a good business practice standpoint, try to account for that in their renewable energy purchasing. So how are we doing on that carbon-free energy goal? Well, this is sort of a snapshot that we use to describe our progress towards that. So the high level number is 64%. On a global average, we're at 64% carbon-free energy on an hourly basis, and we have a goal of getting to 100% by 2030. I think this chart really shows just how difficult that is, because really it is a grid by grid average that builds up to that 64%. And then so for each of these grids, what we call these heat clocks, which is in the lower left, you can see how to read those, but it is a ratio of the green, which is meant to be carbon-free energy resources like wind and solar, but also things like hydro or geothermal. And then compared to the dark gray or the black, which are carbon-intensive resources like natural gas or coal. You can see that in a place like, I don't know, pick Singapore. Singapore is a very dark circle, and that's because Singapore around the clock is almost entirely powered by natural gas. And Google would be the first to admit that we've really struggled to find ways to procure renewable energy in a place like Singapore due to a lot of local grid constraints. And so that has a very low carbon-free energy score. As alternatively, you could go to a place like, let's say, Iowa in the upper left, where Iowa is both a windy state. There's a lot of good solar and wind resources, but also Google historically has bought a lot of wind in Iowa historically. And so we have a very high 96% CFE score. And if you average all of these circles out, weighted against their actual load, you get to the 64% number. Now, to get to 100% on a global basis means getting every single one of these circles to fully green by 2030. I think it's fair to say that is a bit of a moonshot goal, but we are still marching towards that as best we can. We just try to be transparent with where we are on this journey and just how difficult it is in order to hit that. So when we talk about carbon-free energy, we think about it in terms of three pillars. The first is purchasing, and that's going out and buying renewable energy. And that's primarily the power purchase agreements that I talked about previously, where this is either through a green tariff or through PPAs or through, in some cases, they're sort of bundled direct contracts. This is us offsetting our non-carbon-free energy usage with the carbon-free energy associated with the purchase. The second one is technology, and I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but the second one is technology, where we're talking about new technologies other than just solar and wind that we try to promote and invest in order to build an all of the above approach for addressing our carbon footprint. And third is policy, and this relates to, I think those on this call are well used to just how much the regulatory and policy landscape play an outsized impact in the energy industry. And so we hold that very close to heart here at Google and have a whole team dedicated to managing the regulatory and policy landscape associated with the grids in which we operate so that we can increase access to clean energy. So the first pillar I mentioned was purchasing. And here's a couple numbers that to give you a sense of the scale that Google has operated. We have 80 different renewable energy projects we've signed offtake agreements with, and that totals over 10 gigawatts or 10,000 megawatts of new clean capacity that is new to the earth based on Google's offtake commitment. And as you see these different bubbles coming up, this is a time scale of how these projects have come on since 2012 when we first started our program. And so you can see at the beginning, a number of green, which represents wind, popping up all over North America and Europe. Then over time, we added in layers of solar to help us address the non-wind hours. And then ultimately, we've got some hydro and some storage coming in there. This just gives you a sense of, how geographically dispersed our renewable energy purchases are. One other thing that I think is particularly cool about these investments is that there's a local impact too of the 10 gigawatts of projects that we've built roughly equates to about $10 billion of local investment. So these are not small checks that Google ends up writing associated with this. We have a very large energy footprint, and so we really try to be commensurate in our offsetting renewable energy commitments, and it ends up being a very large dollar investment on behalf of our company that I hope shows just how seriously we take it. The second pillar I talked about was technology. On the left are all of the technologies that we would consider part of counting towards carbon-free energy, and there's the more traditional ones like solar, wind, but some of the less traditional ones that you wouldn't think of necessarily off the bat, like geothermal and low-impact hydro. And Google is in sort of all different stages of investment across these different technologies. But I think it's fair to say it's still early days with a lot of these new technologies. And Google thinks about it where we are trying to rather than necessarily single-handedly get all of these technologies off the ground simultaneously through our own investment, or making small, for example, pilot investments in some of these technologies to help these industries get off the ground and hopefully get to the point where they develop into their own kind of fully fledged industries like solar and wind have.
Hey, Reid, I saw I do have a hand up. I think, Josh, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, I was actually just about to type it out in the chat. I was wondering how integrating storage at some of your facilities has affected the kind of ROIs that y'all are seeing on your renewable systems. Although, I mean, I guess I'm sure you guys are having to look at it from a more holistic portfolio kind of sense. So maybe ROI is not the best tool for that.
Sure, it's a great question, and I'll talk a little bit about storage a little bit later on. But in terms of integrating with our renewable energy projects, you're precisely right that, you know, in general, an energy storage project is just going to increase the cost relative to the revenue associated that it's able to generate through either energy arbitrage or capacity valuation or something like that. That isn't always the case, but it is fair to say that from a portfolio perspective, generally you want energy storage to be on the smaller part of your overall mix. You know, for example, we did a deal in Virginia where we have a portfolio of assets of solar and wind and storage, and we ran a bunch of different permutations of, well, what if you did X amount of storage compared with Y amount of solar and Z amount of wind, and what if you toggle those different numbers up and down so that you maintain, in this case, 90% carbon-free energy around the clock. And so you can run different scenarios where, well, what if you oversize your solar and wind resources and undersize your energy storage? And you can look at the cost associated with that. And we found that in most cases, at least in Virginia, for example, it was more economically beneficial to have a very small sliver of storage. I think we only have about 20 megawatts of storage in that particular facility, and oversize the wind and solar so that you're naturally going to have excess generation in certain hours of the day when the sun is really shining or the wind is really blowing. But from an economic standpoint, it still makes sense compared to increasing the size of your energy storage. Now, that is it all comes down to a case-by-case basis, and typically places where energy storage gets a lot of value, typically where there's a large capacity payment associated with them, is where you're going to see better economics. So, for example, we have a large solar and storage investment in Nevada, and in that case, because they have such large solar penetration, adding a firming resource like storage provides a large capacity value to the system there. So we were able to upsize the storage component in Nevada, and it made economic sense for us to do so.
Awesome, thank you.
Sort of answer your question.
Great.
Yeah, for sure. It's, sure everyone here is kind of struggling to figure out where that fits in, just because, obviously this is a Georgia centric kind of organization, but lots of us have representation in other states, and kind of the net metering or lack thereof that's present in a lot of these markets is really frustrating the process. But it makes sense to kind of build out a matrix and see where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense.
Sure.
So, Reid, before you move forward, a question we had in the chat, which I think is good or worth addressing, is making the distinction when you say renewable energy versus talking about carbon-free energy, and just how are you all distinguishing that, or why are you using that distinction? Because first you had the 100% renewable energy goal, but now you switched terms, carbon-free energy, and so if you could kind of maybe speak to that.
Sure, it's a great point and an astute observation. We definitely did change our verbiage for that. Basically, in our previous goal of 100% renewable energy matching, we only wanted projects that we made additional to the world through our renewable energy power purchase agreements. And for that, it's almost always done through these zero marginal cost resources like solar and wind, and we offset 100% of our usage with them. For carbon-free energy, we change our definition a little bit where we lean more on the existing clean energy resources in the grid. In places like where there's large nuclear existing or there's large hydro that's powering the grid, we count that towards our carbon-free energy goal. And our thinking being why create unnecessary investment into the grid if it's already relatively clean, and rewarding grids that have relatively clean grids that have existing hydro and nuclear. Now, I shouldn't say never, but in most cases, it doesn't make sense for Google to do our own power purchase agreement to build a new, utility scale nuclear facility or hydro facility that wasn't built like in the 50s, like many of these were. And so we count those, even though we're not signing power purchase agreements with that power from the grid. We're only building incremental to what is already clean on the grid, and we wanted to make sure we accounted for resources like nuclear and hydro.
Okay,
So maybe
thank you.
just to dive a tad bit deeper into that, how are you all kind of doing the math on whether or not a particular source is carbon free? Like, how precise are you trying to get? Are you doing like a life cycle assessment associated with that energy production? Are you more talking about, like, in general, nuclear is carbon free? There's obviously materials that go into constructing a nuclear plant, and there's other considerations for it. Just curious if you could maybe speak to that.
Sure, it's definitely closer to the latter of those two examples that you said. We have done these life cycle analyses, but I think, as many of you know, when you start getting into that, really any resource has its pros and cons that are associated with it. Carbon-free energy is really a shorthand for low carbon intensive resources, even though they're not entirely perfectly clean in every single way. And the technologies on the left are what we have sort of counted towards that. Now, we're always open to adding towards that list as new technologies get developed and revised over time, but that's kind of how we currently look at it. And what we did is we zoomed out and said, all right, in a future world where we eliminate gas and coal from the grid, what are all the resources that are going to need to be on the grid in order for that to happen? And that's how we got to the list that we did. It does not create a perfect carbon-free future, but it's a very, very, very significantly carbon-reduced future if we can get gas and coal off of the grid.
Just one last quick follow-up question from Marcus is, what is Google's take on viability of SMR?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think the general, I believe you're referring to small and medium reactors in the nuclear space. And in general, I think we're fairly bullish in the space. I think it is difficult to make it work commercially for just given where the technology is from the development standpoint, and you're talking, decade plus development time for many of their technologies. We are actively looking at the nuclear space for us, just because we think it's an important part of the technology mix overall. How we build that into our structuring and our procurement program is still something that we're still working out. But we definitely are bullish on its overall impact to the general carbon-free transition that we're hoping to see on a national and a global basis.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Sure. So we talked a little bit about the pillars. The first pillar was procurement, the second pillar being policy, of technology. And then the third pillar, which I want to talk briefly about, is policy. And so for this slide, kind of talks about the policy and regulation that we're addressing. But the example was raised of net metering in Georgia. Like, that's if we wanted to do more solar in Georgia, that would be the type of policy that we would go about trying to change, or in many cases working with folks like you all to change. And that's a big part of our philosophy, is that it's a coalition building of other like-minded parties that we work hard to cooperate with, and then also building a coalition of others who adopt the 24/7 CFE process. You know, Google, I pointed out some of the numbers of our energy usage, certainly a very large energy user, but the largest energy user in the country is the US federal government. And many people don't know, but they also have a 24/7 goal. Biden signed it into law through an executive order, I want to say in 2021. And so we work actively with the federal government and their Center for Environmental Quality to work towards figuring out ways for them to buy around the clock carbon-free energy for their federal buildings as well. And you know, Microsoft, Iron Mountain, others have these similar goals as well. So we count that as part of our regulatory and policy pillar of building coalitions of other like-minded organizations, kind of marching towards the same goals that we have. So now I was going to just talk about a few of some of the other innovations that we have going on at Google. And this first one is relevant in that we talk about battery storage. And in this one, we're using it for battery storage backup at our data center in Belgium, which you can see here in this picture. As many of you know, the data centers, you know, our primary grid source or energy source is obviously from the grid. The secondary energy source for backup power is through backup generators, and those are usually powered with diesel. Diesel obviously goes against the core philosophy of our carbon-free energy goals, and I think we'd be the first to admit that. And so we're always actively looking for ways to mitigate or reduce the amount of diesel backup generators that we need. And this was our first big punch into that by replacing a set of diesel backup generators in Belgium with battery storage backup. We were talking earlier about the ROI of storage. You know, data centers are designed to have 5 nines of reliability. So that means they're up 99.999% of the time. And so that it's incredibly valuable during those very rare instances where the grid goes out that the data center stays up. It's a very high marginal value to Google, and therefore a very high willingness to pay for those batteries. So that's an instance where, yes, batteries are expensive. We hear the adage that battery storage is quote unquote too expensive, but if you find the right use cases, for example, data center backup, sometimes the willingness to pay makes the ROI and the economics work, and we were able to make that work here in Belgium. A couple other cool things we're working on. This is what we call carbon intelligent computing, and this slide talks about doing that on a timescale basis. So what we're effectively doing is taking signals from the grid and using that to schedule our computing. So for example, let's say we have some machine learning training that's being done during the middle of the day, and we realize that, oh, the sun is not actually up yet, and so most of our solar projects in that particular data center aren't generating. Well, we're using signals from the grid, in this case day ahead dispatch scheduling, to schedule some of those compute programs more intelligently, so they align with the production profiles of our wind and solar generation. This allows us to make sure that we are making the most of the hours where we have high CFE scores, and limiting the amount of compute we're doing in hours that don't have as high of CFE scores. Now, this is a relatively new program for us, and still a bit of a blunt instrument. So, for example, we're only using day-ahead signals, and I think anybody who's looked at their weather app on their phone and has only trusted a little bit for the weather forecast the next day, kind of applies here too. We only can rely on day-ahead signals so much, and there's only so much compute that we can still move around. Ultimately, if somebody clicks a YouTube video, we can't tell them to wait a few hours until the wind is blowing a little bit stronger. They're going to use that YouTube video when they want to use it. And so we're still working on chipping away at that part. And then the other axis that we use to do this, and there should be a map of the globe underneath these circles. I don't know if you can, if that's showing up as well, but think of this as a geographical axis where in this case, we can look at where we have wind and solar shining and can move across data centers opposed to across time. So think of that same machine learning standpoint. Well, let's say it's a particularly not windy day in Iowa, but it is windy that day in Virginia, where we have another wind resource. Well, we'll move our machine learning from that Iowa data center to that Virginia data center in that particular day. Again, this is early days, so we're still figuring out just how to do this and to how much compute we can move. But it is this carbon intelligent computing is a way that we think is a powerful tool in our toolkit above and beyond just the renewable energy purchasing we do. And then the last piece of carbon intelligent computing is one that I think many people on this phone call are familiar with, which is demand response. And in this way, we're trying to figure out what can we just fundamentally reduce in our energy usage instead of shifting around based on signals from the grid. And this is based on demand response signals from the grid saying, hey, we're right on the verge of having to turn on this next marginal natural gas plant. We would ask that you curtail your energy usage by X amount. Well, we are now curtailing the amount of compute in our data center based on those signals. And so these are things that are non-time sensitive. So again, use that machine learning for an example. We have machine learning running all the time, trying to help understand the internet, all of these different things. We can, all else being equal, we have these data centers built, we might as well run our machine learning. But if we're getting carbon signals from the grid, we can always curtail that. And we're getting better and better at figuring out how and how much we can curtail based on these responses from the grid. And then from an innovation standpoint, lastly, I just want to talk a bit about the community impact. So DEI is a very important part of our the energy transition for us, and we account for it in many of our deal structuring that we do. One example that highlighted here is a deal we did in North and South Carolina, where we invested in a large amount of distributed solar, and a chunk of that revenue goes towards households, low and moderate income households, to help them do pre-weatherization. As in a lot of these communities that are older homes or less kept up homes, just because they are not well weatherized, the overall the energy cost becomes a huge part of these folks' monthly bills, their monthly budgeting, and just a small amount of pre-weatherization that many of us take for granted does a huge amount of lowering that monthly bill for these communities that really need it. So this is just an example. We have a number of these that Google has done, where we're trying to make an impact in the local communities, the same communities where we have our data centers, that benefit from the renewable energy purchasing that we're doing.
Sorry, real quick, Reid, on that one. Was that be an example where you all were just interested in pulling the rec attributes from the project and let the energy itself serve the communities that were in proximity?
Right. It depends. This one in particular, we actually had the bundled energy, so the energy didn't go to these different LMI households in many cases because of the net metering challenges that were raised earlier. So we buy all the energy associated with that and sleeve that to our data centers. That's just how this particular one happened to work.
Gotcha. Thanks.
One of the resources that I point many of you to, I'm a big podcast guy. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I love how-to podcasts on how things work. Well, this is fundamentally a podcast about how the internet works. It's called Where the Internet Lives, and it's produced by Google, but it really applies to any data center, any internet infrastructure company. And it really digs into the details from kind of a pop science standpoint of how the internet works and how data centers work and things. It talks about energy and renewable energy, but really just breaks down in simple terms how data centers work. So if you just go, there's a link here. If you go to google.com/data centers, or if you just go to any podcast app that you prefer and just search where the internet lives. There's a couple seasons that we've done so far. It's won a number of awards, not just because it's produced by Google, but because it funnily, demystifies data centers as a whole. Is a great resource for those looking to just understand data centers better and how they work and why they work and their impact on local communities and that sort of thing. So that was all the slides I had today. If you want to hear more about our kind of carbon-free energy journey, we have a number of white papers, a number of pretty cool animations and things that help spell out a lot of the details that I wasn't able to get to today. There's the link there in the lower right that you're welcome to click on or enter into a tab and look more into this and provide more detail. But with that, I'm happy to step back and answer more Q&A any of you all have.
Well, Reid, I'll just kick us off just to ask a bit about the data aspect of it for that 24/7. Can you maybe speak to that as a challenge, right? And making sure you're getting the data you need from your utility partner to know whether or not you're reaching your goal of matching that hour by hour to carbon-free resources.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question and one that we work a lot on, and yet we have a really long ways to go as well. We build in our contracts to the data feeds in order to have the data we need to piece together hourly matching. So we get hourly data, sometimes as basic as just like an hourly spreadsheet, or sometimes more advanced than that. But for the most part, we are on the back end piecing together these hourly structures and reporting data based on our own internal analytics. There is not yet a global or even national standard for time-based environmental attributes. We've got a number of deals in the hopper. We're trying to build up those systems so that there is a little bit more of a standardized use, but in part because we have helped evangelize carbon-free energy, at least hourly carbon-free energy. We have really taken upon ourselves to build out our own data systems in order to calculate that. I'll go back to the slide that has the heat clocks. Oops, there we go. These heat clocks were put together through internal analytics, and so the utility in Georgia is going to give us different data than, for example, the utility in, I don't know, Alabama or Oregon or Nebraska. And so we've had to right size all of that data internally on our end in order to make these sort of unified heat clocks across the globe.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions from our audience? If you want, you can just come off mute or you can hit the raise your hand button and I'll find you. Don't be shy. There you go. Who's that? Go ahead. Sorry, I can't see who that is. You physically raised your hand there.
Yeah. Marcus Hassan, Truist, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah. Hey, Reid, appreciate the insight. A question, and if it's okay, a follow-up question. But let me ask the question first. So, on the earlier slide, you kind of had the three pillars of Google's 24/7 carbon-free energy strategy. And so my question is on the third one, the championing greening the utility grid. In your work, in that area, what are you finding the challenges being the utilities? Is it being able to do it economically? Is it technology not quite there yet? Is it just lack of other incentives? What is kind of, I guess, the cheat code for being able to accelerate that? So companies like ours don't have to work as hard with, RECs and on-site renewable and the accounting histrionics that go with that.
Sure. I mean, I wish I had a cheat code. That does sound like it sounds like a great thing to have in this case. It really is a case-by-case basis across the different utilities. I think the biggest unifying theme that we've seen is just a lack of understanding or appreciation from utilities on what their customers want. And that goes back to the coalition building piece. In Iowa, with, not to pick on Mid-American, but Mid-American, very early on in our wind days, there was sort of this, they pushed back where it's like, hey, only Google is really all that interested in wind purchasing. So we're not going to set up a whole program just for that. We got together with a lot of our other, large industrial users, data center users in Iowa, and kind of put together a coalition to sit down with the utility and say, hey, there's actually quite a bit of demand for this type of thing. And oh, by the way, this is not just a random thought we have. We've put quite a bit of thought into structuring this and how this might work and how to protect the other ratepayers, how to make sure that Mid-American is made whole on any investments, how to make sure, all of the different sort of contractual pieces are accounted for, and we're able to make that work. We had a similar program that we started with TVA. They have a green tariff called Green Invest that was very similar, where originally Google was kind of the only one that was part of that. And then as we brought more partners together, we were able to make that work. I think our experience in Georgia is probably similar to yours, where it's a bit slower going than we would necessarily like. I think, we are working with groups like yours to bring together like-minded companies to try to figure out what we might want. I know, because when those other arguments, things like cost, things like technology come up, we can kind of get our heads together and figure out the best way to make that case, such that we can credibly kind of push back against those challenges that the utilities are raising.
Marcus, do you have a follow-up?
Yes. Thanks, Reid, for the insight. Yeah, the follow-up, and this is a little bit off track, but since we have you captive here, I wanted to ask, and this is purely the data center portfolio. Has Google identified any opportunities where you're able to provide the waste heat from your data centers to, say a district heating, to where, the heat can be used, either sold or provided? That's kind of, you talk about some of the community alliances. So I know some of Google's data centers are at scale and probably produce waste heat that's of sufficient temperature where, it could be used in some manufacturing. So I was just curious, if you can talk about it, if you guys are doing any of that. I know it's gained some traction in Northern Europe.
Great question. Short answer is no, not yet. We've looked at it quite a bit, because exactly as you've said, there's all this waste heat that is high quality and could be used for a number of different ways, even just a small revenue generation to help offset some of the costs of our renewable energy program. Combination of where our data centers are located, the kind of unique engineering structure that we use to build our data centers, and just lack of a good opportunity from a proximity standpoint nearby. And for example, places like Northern Europe, we have not been able to make it work. But we have a whole advanced technology and innovation group that spends their time looking at a lot of that engineering, including on topics like waste heat, to see what they might be able to put together. It's something we're actively working on. I can't say that we have a good, solid example of where we've been able to pull it off yet.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
Other questions? So if you have a question, we'll just come off mute and throw it out there. I don't see any hands raised. So sort of I'll fill the space with a sort of engineering type question that probably you will be able to address, Reid, which is, I know I toured Meta's data centers out here near where I live in Newton County in Georgia, and the key to cooling for them is air movement, right? And so a lot of just keeping air flowing through the stacks, and then pulling that hot air out of the stacks and bringing cool air in and sort of keeping things circulating. Uh, similar for you all in terms of trying to use very efficient ways of keeping those servers cool.
Yep, exactly right. And there's a bunch of different engineering ways in which one does that. One example is with hot and cold aisles. So if you think about your lap, that's the way I think about it. If you think about your laptop, like it's the bottom of it that gets really hot and the top of it is less important. Well, servers work the same way. On the backside is what gets really hot and needs to have the hot air sucked out, and the front is really just a bunch of lights and things. So we alternate hot and cold aisles where we face the servers based on whether or not there's air suction or not. And so therefore you only basically need to cool roughly half the amount of space you would have otherwise. Rather than cooling the entire data center room, you're just cooling specific aisles and using plastic to basically to wall off what we call those hot aisles. A separate piece is basically we've done a lot of engineering on the servers themselves where they're able to withstand quite a bit of heat. So if you walk into one of our data center rooms, it's not all that cold. In fact, it's quite hot. You look around, all the data center techs are wearing shorts and t-shirts because we've just got it where the servers are able to live baseline within relatively hot circumstances. That significantly reduces the amount of cooling we need to do and the amount of energy and water needed to do that cooling. But the philosophy is very much the same as with any other data center company like Meta.
That's great. Who else has a question? There we go. I figured I could count on you.
Yeah, this is Scott Hassel, also from Truist. I'll jump in. So, as you all have obviously been at this a while, you've got a team that works on these things, but as you talk to other companies that are trying to get started, I'm curious if you have any suggestions on how to really get started on kind of the enterprise level strategy. If you look at your footprint and you say, I've got, regulated areas, I've got deregulated areas, I'd love to have impact where I use power, but how do I kind of get started at that like high level strategy perspective rather than saying, hey, let's go, try to procure in this state or that state. Any suggestions on how to get started with that high level strategy?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I've been at Google now about 5.5 years. Before that, I was with Amazon for about 5 years. I started Amazon's original renewable energy practice. And if there's anything we learned at Amazon, they were relatively far along at Google when I joined. But if there's anything we learned in Amazon, it was not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, where there's only so much strategy that we were able to put together without just ultimately putting a transaction down on the table and using it as a precedent-setting case. Our first wind farm at Amazon was in Indiana, and it was the type of thing where we put together a deal composition and just went up internally. Everybody we can talk to, whether that's our accounting partners, our finance partners, our legal partners, and just kept bringing this deal up for consideration and kept bringing up kept raising all the challenges and questions that were coming from these different organizations, so that by the time we actually had a fully fledged contract that we wanted to execute on, it wasn't just my team that was on board with this. We had this kind of internal coalition that folks that had helped kind of build this business case. And it's a cool concept to get behind, right? You're like, hey, today I worked on like a wind farm deal. Like people generally like to go home and talk to their significant other and say like, hey, listen to this cool thing that I worked on today. Like those are things that generally I think people get generally excited about working up on. and we were able to build that case at Amazon. That's just my own Reid's experience based on my experience at Amazon. I think at Google, what we found is that really leaning on other like-minded organizations to see what sort of resources that they have. You know, I think I showed a slide that talked about the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance here, or sorry, Buyers Association here, where CEBA has put together a ton of resources on sort of how to size these things, how to think about gauging different risks, how to build internal buy-in, like I just talked about. Google is a very active member of CEBA, and we've been working hard to sort of promote a lot of those different resources that CEBA has pulled together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Reid. Thanks for sharing today.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, and if any of you are not already connected with CEBA, we'd be happy to facilitate that. We've got good connections there. I really appreciate your plugging, the idea of like-minded companies coming together, and that's really the mindset we've had working with the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact. Is these companies are all struggling ultimately with a similar kind of challenge of how do we get the power that we buy to be less carbon intensive, and when you try to do it on a onesie-twosie basis or one-on-one with the utility, that can get frustrating. So by coming together, sharing what our common needs and interests are, engaging the utilities collectively to try to figure out some creative paths forward, and then leaning on companies like Google, who have a tremendous amount of experience, to help us to best navigate this landscape.
For sure.
Any other? We're right about 1 minute from time, but any other questions? Last questions? I would just thank Reid. Thank you again for spending the hour with us, for sharing Google's journey, and we really appreciate your partnership, and we'll probably continue to stay in touch with you and bring those lessons learned from Google into the compact as we continue our conversations and strategizing with our utility partners. So we really appreciate that. And thank you to all of you all for spending the hour with us as well. And I hope you all learned a lot from Reid's presentation. And thanks again. Look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks for having me. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Take care, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.